Hi, how's it going? Welcome back to the Comic Experience. Right now we're going to be discussing the concepts of word art and onomatopoeia. The sound, boom, bing, bang, pow, zoom, those are all examples of onomatopoeia. So, what we want to do at this point in the Comic Experience is combine word art and onomatopoeia. One of the very first things I do in the classroom is I'll write up a word. Any typical word doesn't really matter. I'll write it in regular print. Beside it, I'll write the word in word art. Then what I'll do is I'll have a discussion with my students about the comparison, basically. How do they compare? How do they differ? From there, I describe the concept that is onomatopoeia, and I'll go through and I'll review it with my students. I'll play maybe a few made-up games with them, like, hey, tell me an example of onomatopoeia. Everyone stand up, say boom, bing, bang, zim, zoom. A bunch of different ideas for you there. After that, what we want to do is take the concept of word art, take the concept of onomatopoeia, and combine it. Once you do that, this sheet is ultimately what you get. The example of splat, clunk, kablam, boom, pow, splunk, bam, zap. Those are all different examples of how word art and onomatopoeia can be combined. Now, if you notice, this sheet's in color. So, for example, the word splat, you can kind of see the image that follows it. It's kind of made out of water, consistent with that in a sense. The example of pow, if you notice there, or zap, they all have some type of image that kind of relates to the sound. That's something that we want our students to get an understanding of. Furthermore, at this point, I typically show my students a color wheel, and I really talk to them about complementary colors. I think it's just a good example as well as a good point in time to review that with them. So if you notice, there are 8 panels. The top 8 are for students to recreate what they see. There are 2 slightly larger panels that can be found at the bottom. These panels are for students to create their own examples. And again, you want to remind them to be creative. Welcome back, guys. This next page is all about building backgrounds. One of the first things I do, just like with the others, is I tend to read the top portion to them. There are always a few tidbits of information that your students, as well as yourself, can use. I normally get into the significance of background. A lot of the times we have our students, as they're going through the different panels, what they'll do is they'll create a character and they'll leave this character in limbo. Basically, they'll create a character, but there's no background, so we have no clue where they're at. Background really instills a sense of the location, the setting, so to say, as to the comic. And it really helps if we were thinking of the main idea and details. If you take a look at the very first image, which kind of has the mountains and the stream and the trees, as a main idea, we might be able to sum it up and say that that's somewhat of a forest, whereas for details we can definitely mention the mountains, the trees, the stream, the house. From here, after you discuss the main idea and details of the picture, the main idea basically being the setting, the details essentially being what make up the setting. For example, the mountains or the trees or the buildings that can be found or the fence that's in the image next to it. After that, you want your students to recreate it, and at this point in time, they don't need to focus at all on the character. If you wanted to have them add a character, I would have them create everything first, then go back, add the character, and from there, ultimately, color it. What I like to do, after every one of these pages, I always like to show examples of student work. So what I'll do is I'll showcase it with my DocuCam. If you don't have a DocuCam or a projector, you can always take a picture of it and maybe show it on a laptop. And that's basically the page that is building backgrounds. Thanks a lot, guys. Hi there again. If you notice, the next 3 pages are titled the superhero activity, the amazing problem activity, and ultimately the space adventure activity. Every one of these pages describes some type of situation, you could say, at the very top of it. And if you notice, there are normally 4 lines right beneath the writing. Those 4 lines are for your students to kind of brainstorm. So they would begin to answer the questions that are imposed upon them within the top portion, And from there, they're going to answer them, think of the who, where, what, when, why. That's the typical type of question. And they're going to be working on answering those. From there, after they go ahead and write out what it's going to be about, you want to have them move into their panels. So, if we were to think about it, this would be panel number 1, panel number 2, panel 3, and panel 4. What our students are going to do is sequence a story out. So they've learned all of these skills. For example, they've worked on drawing lines, different types of shapes. They've worked on a dialogue for various characters. They've worked on different types of backgrounds and settings. They've even gone as far as to work on onomatopoeia and word art. So now this is a place for them to take all of that information and put it together into one product. Think of this as a showcase of everything that they've learned. After they finish writing at the top portion what their story is going to be about, their job is to actually draw the characters, add the dialogue, and from there, go ahead, color it with colored pencils. We tend to use colored pencils just because crayons make it look not as neat, you could say, or not as artistic. Also, when we've found that educators use markers, it tends to bleed through the page, and sometimes students will kind of rub it with their hand as they're working on coloring it, and it'll bleed throughout the page. So, colored pencils, most of the time, recommended. Once they've finished, or even if they haven't finished, I love to play the mingle game. If you recall, that game was a simple mingle, 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 a mingle, 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 2. And then they'd get into a pair of 2. From there, they discuss so far what they've created. It's just a great idea for getting your students to share. After that, if you wanted to add on to it, something else that you could do as an extension is to have your students get into pairs through maybe use of the mingle game and act out a specific scene. Just another idea for you, but this is basically the last step in the sloppy copy. Thanks a lot. Hi, how's it going, guys? Just jumped right into the panel here, multitasking. What we're going to be doing is reviewing the entire process that we've gone through. If you notice, the very first page of the comic experience starts off with something that looks like this. Your job is to get your students to recreate the images. You're giving them the essentials of drawing. If they can draw a shape, if they can create that, if they can recreate these lines, they can draw. Right after that, we move into our second page. The second page, if you recall, has characters and it actually has dialogue boxes. The only difference here is that your students are going to need to write the dialogue. After this, I love to play the mingle game. It gives them the opportunity to get up, stand up, walk around the classroom, and share the information that they have with their students. If, in case you forgot, the mingle game goes like a mingle, 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 2, and then they would get into that type of a pair. From there, we move on to page 3. Page 3, again, has characters. The only difference this time is that the characters have no box. Your students, remember, step 1, write the dialogue out. Step 2, create the dialogue box around it. From there, page 4 was all about 2 things, word art and onomatopoeia, and taking those 2 ideas and combining them to get one result. So if you notice, the word art, it's basically taking a word and making it look artistic. Also, examples, pow, splat, boom, bing, zam, wow! Examples of onomatopoeia. Our job here is to get your students to combine the ideas. From there, you move on to page 5, which is all about backgrounds. With this particular background, if you notice, there's 1 point perspective because everything is going into this one dot. Also, you'll notice the background includes buildings, there's a road, a street, there are windows and doors, and I even included a character, a very small one, right here. If you recall, this would be a good point to talk about the main idea, maybe main idea for a background like the setting. Maybe the main idea is a city. Some attributes or details that can be found within the city include buildings, a road, a person, doors, windows. Those are things to discuss here. As we move on to the last 3 pages, they're all about the 4-panel comic. This is the place where your students can really practice the different ideas that they've learned and acquired. It's a great time to practice. So they're always going to start off, there will be a topic right across the top. After that, they'll have a few lines where they can write. Think of this writing as a good place to brainstorm. Think of the who, the where, the what, the why, and the when. This is the time for them to mention that. From there, they'll go ahead and move on. If you recall, this is panel number 1, panel 2, panel 3, and panel 4. They would start off by creating the setting, move on to the character. From there, add the dialogue. After that, they'll move on to the next panel. And ultimately, they will create the dialogue. And that's all of it. Thank you very much, guys. That was the comic experience, the sloppy copy. Thanks a lot. See you guys soon.